one we could afford. The Scottish and Brexit referenda in this country have produced major political upheavals, from the demise of the Scottish Labour Party for a while to the end of David Cameron's political career, probably forever, to the UK leaving the EU. So you can perhaps understand the reluctance of the Spanish political class to allow Catalans to hold an independence referendum of their own. Whether it was wise to try and stop it with mass police smashing ballot boxes and thumping voters is another matter. Catalonia is the biggest crisis for Spain since it moved from dictatorship to democracy. It is also a crisis for the EU, which is backing Madrid's hard line. At a time when Presidents Juncker and Macron talk of ever closer union in Europe, why are some European nation-states struggling to hold it together? Historian Niall Ferguson has been putting borders in the spotlight.
In the past couple of weeks, there have been hotly contested referendums on independence in Catalonia and Iraqi Kurdistan. Now, of course, striving for independence is nothing new, but these events are part of a recent trend away from globalization and back to a world of national boundaries.
The sun has risen on an independent United Kingdom.
America first.
Bashing globalism and rebuilding borders worked pretty well to secure victory for Brexit and Donald Trump last year. But returning to a system of nation-state-based international relations, the so-called Westphalian system, might not necessarily be in the best interests of the West or of Britain. We have a disproportionate amount of clout on the United Nations as one of just 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, despite being only the 23rd largest country in the world. And that's because history, being on the winning side of the Second World War, is as much destiny as demography or economics. Today's populists tend to be as dismissive of the UN as they are of the EU. They should think again. A world order based solely on national borders would be one where, as Thucydides said, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. And that could mean an accelerated transfer of power from the West to the East. After all, 5 of the world's 10 largest countries are now Asian. Not one is European.
And Neil joins us now. Welcome.
Nice to be back, Andrew.
So what is happening? But let's stick with Europe for the moment here. You've got politicians like Mr. Macron talking about the need to deepen Europe, have more integration, and you've had independence referendum in Scotland, you have the Catalan situation, there's parts of northern Italy would like to go their own way, Belgium is forever a question mark over it. What's happening?
Well, there is a kind of relationship between European integration and encouragement to secessionist movements. The more Europe looks like Mr. Macron's United States of Europe, the more plausible it becomes to say, well, we don't really need to be in these relatively strong unitary nation states like Spain. We can go from the autonomy that they have in Catalonia now to independence. So I think there's a relationship between European integration and the encouragement of small states. And we saw that in Scotland, where very frequently the Scottish nationalists would argue that they could have independence in this new context that had been created by the European Union.
But the Eurosceptics, like Michael, years ago, used to tell us that it was the project of Brussels to destroy the nation state and create a Europe of 100 regions, because if the regions would be weaker and then Brussels would have the real power. But this week, Vice President Timmermans, the European Commission, has given the Madrid government its full backing, even for the deployment of the Guardia Civil in Barcelona, in Catalonia.
That's right, because I think there's a certain miscommunication here. In practice, there are really 2 visions of the more integrated Europe, and they're not quite the same. Mr. Macron, I think, inclines towards the notion that you can get to a federal state. That is not the German view. It's certainly not Angela Merkel's vision of Europe, which seems to me much more to be a confederation of powerful states, but one in which Germany is not all-powerful, one in which Germany is prepared to share power with France, with Italy, with the other states. So I don't think that the Catalonians were right if they expected that they were going to get support from Brussels. I suspect they didn't. In fact, there's probably more support from Moscow than for Brussels for their efforts. The people who really like the idea of disrupting the major states of Europe are actually the Russians, and I suspect that they're the ones who are cheering on the Catalonians. My scepticism is really a bit the same as I feel about the Northern League in Italy. It's quite hard to make a nationalist movement credible when what you're really saying is we're the richest part of the country. We'd quite like to get rid of the underperforming parts.
And Catalonia, of course, is the richest part of Spain.
Absolutely, just the same way.
Well.
So my inclination is that this probably fizzles out or becomes a kind of Quebec-like or Scottish situation. I agree with what you said earlier, though. If they're very heavy-handed in Madrid, then it's possible that they might create some kind of radicalisation in Barcelona. Let's hope not.
Michael?
Well, I think that's the way it's headed at the moment. I mean, no one is talking about talking at the moment. No one is prepared to set aside preconditions to talks. So at the moment it is looking very grim. I mean, for a long time I thought it was a terrific advantage that Spain had, the defence of the constitution for its integration, which we don't have in Britain. We don't have a constitution that defends us against Scottish independence. But now that constitution is turning out to be a very blunt weapon because Spain feels obliged to enforce that constitution by force.
Yeah.
Holland hasn't had a government for 6 months now, a new government since the election. We've a situation in Spain with Catalonia, which seems really serious. Mrs. Merkel's probably going to take to Christmas to form a new government too, because it's going to be much more complicated. Mr. Macron is unlikely to get his way on the Eurozone reforms that he wants. I wonder if the Europeans will have time to handle Brexit. They've got so many things on their agenda.
But haven't they slightly lost interest in Brexit?
That's
exactly.
It ceased to be a topic.
It isn't
on
the
the
topic.
They got maybe bigger fish to fry.
It wasn't debated, as far as I understand, very much in the German elections. But to go back to your... I mean, the question for me is, in a more globalised economy, are we better off coming into smaller and smaller entities, or do we believe that our institutions like the UN or the EU, if properly reformed, are the best way to deal with that? Because you're not going to disinvent China or India. So that is my question.
And it's a question we're going to have to leave things on. But it is a big question because the move was always to go bigger. And maybe what's happening now could reverse that with consequences we don't know. You've just published a new book. Give us the title.
The Square and the Tower, Networks, Hierarchies and the Struggle for Global Power.
So a short title.
Well, it's a subtitle that I gave you as well as the title. I wasn't just going to give you the title.
Social network. No, I've seen